Good morning, Mike. It's great to have you here this morning.
Thank you. Thank you.
I love topics like this, serious topics to bring awareness, and I really enjoy it. So I'm really looking forward to all your answers.
Good, good.
So to start with, why is Victims' Right Week important?
Yeah, April is National Crime Victims' Rights Month. And just a couple of weeks ago, we had our big annual vigil, our 27th annual, Steve, 27th annual Crime Victims Vigil.
Wow.
Crime Victims' Rights Month is important for two reasons. The first is it gives us a chance to celebrate and recognize just how much progress we've made over the last 30 years in terms of victims' rights. 30 years ago, many of the things that are just commonplace now in the criminal justice system, they didn't exist. Crime victims were an afterthought. Their voices weren't heard. The system was not responsive to their needs and to what they wanted to say. And so now it's changed very, very much. And so that's one of the reasons why we love Crime Victims' Rights Month, is because it gives us a chance to recognize all that progress we've made. But the second reason that it's important is because it reminds us that even though the progress we've made, we've still got a long ways to go. There are still lots of victims out there that I describe as suffering in silence. Victims that suffer in silence because they don't know where to go, they don't know where to turn, they don't understand the resources that are out there, and we want to make sure that we continue to raise the level of awareness so that those folks can come forward.
Mike, that response right there is a great segue into my question. Why is crime victims, I guess the awareness, but why is it increasing? You know, you said, 30 years ago it was at one level, but now there really is this deliberate emphasis in April and May to address crime victims and to provide assistance. So what prompted all this attention now?
I think it's really two things. I think it kind of may have started with people in the field, people in the criminal justice field, people in the advocacy field, began to push and to say, hey, the way we're treating victims is not always right. It's not always fair. We need to give them a more powerful voice. And then I think once that began to really kind of take hold, we've started to see it become more and more acceptable in our communities to talk about these things. These are things that in the past weren't talked about, particularly child abuse, child sex abuse, sexual assault, topics that are uncomfortable to talk about. And because of the shame and guilt that go along with so many of those things, it was difficult to talk about. And I think that public perception is beginning to change to where we realize now that our victims aren't to blame. It's not their fault. And so it's okay to talk about that. It's okay to bring that out into the open. And it's okay for us to begin or continue the dialogue to see how we can serve them better.
I agree, because I think there was this cultural mindset that there's just some things you don't talk about publicly.
That's right.
You know it exists and it's taken place, but no, we just don't go there. Where today, people take time to
I think
address
you're exactly
that.
right.
I know we've been talking about crime victims and their rights. Can you tell us a little bit about what are their rights?
Yes, some of the more prominent victims' rights in Oklahoma are victims have a right to be notified of what their rights are. That's a great starting point. How can I exercise my rights if I don't know what they are? So that's a starting point. They have a right to be told about what their rights are. They have a right to know about certain financial assistance that may be available to them in restitution. Several programs out there to deal with the financial loss and the financial damage caused by crime. They also have a right to be protected if they are threatened or in fear of being harmed in some way simply because they've agreed to cooperate in a court case. They have a right to get some protection. They have a right to be notified of all the significant events in their case. They have a right to be heard. They have a right at the sentencing hearing to go in and tell the judge, hey, here's how I feel about this case. Here's how it's impacted my life. And here's my opinion about what should happen to the person that's being held accountable for that. They have a right to be involved on the back end too, during the appeal process and during the parole process. So all these rights, they didn't exist just a couple of decades ago.
It's amazing, just that statement there, that it didn't exist to where it is today. You would think that fairness and that representation would have always been there. Our special guest this morning, Good Morning Enid, is Mike Field, District Attorney for District 4. Mike represents 5 counties here in the central part of the state. Mike, I think we kind of have a handle on understanding domestic violence, but can you kind of give us a textbook definition of what domestic violence really is?
Certainly. The way I define domestic violence is it is a pattern of behavior designed to establish and maintain control over someone's partner. The tactics involved in establishing and maintaining this control are a couple of things we've already talked about. Guilt, fear, shame, intimidation, coercion, and then of course violence. All those things are used to establish and to maintain that control over someone's partner.
I know it's always hard to imagine when we talk about topics like this, it's hard to imagine that we have that where we live, you know? But can you tell us if we have that issue here in Garfield County?
We do. We are not unlike everywhere else in the nation. Here in Garfield County, last year, the DA's office reviewed about 500 incident reports involving allegations of domestic violence. And of those 500, we ended up filing charges in about 200 of those. But I've been doing this a long time, been a prosecutor for over 20 years now. I know that those 500 reports, I know that that's the tip of the iceberg. Because we know that Oklahoma, unfortunately, we're the leaders in a lot of great things, as you all know. But unfortunately, we're among the leaders in the numbers of women who are victims of domestic violence. We're leaders among the states for the number of women that are killed at the hands of their abusers. And we're also one of the leaders in sexual assault. So in terms of those areas, we've got a long ways to go.
Mike, you've addressed the issue earlier in our interview about crime victims' rights, what they can do. On domestic violence, somebody who may be watching the program, what words can you offer to them on what they can do if they have found themselves in a domestic violence situation?
Great question. Great question.
Because they may feel trapped.
Absolutely. I mean, that's part of how and why domestic violence becomes as big of a problem as it does, is because that isolation, that intentional isolation by the person, by the abuser, becomes a powerful reason for a woman, because we know statistically speaking it's overwhelmingly women, why they stay in those relationships. But what I would say to the question of what someone can do is simply hold up their hand. Just simply hold up their hand and reach out to someone to say, hey, I need some help. It doesn't have to be the police. It doesn't have to be 911. It doesn't have to be the DA's office. It can be a friend, a coworker. I know that our faith community in our town is doing more and more in these areas. So it may be someone at a church, at their church. Then of course the YWCA. I blow the YWCA's horn any and every chance I get. They provide fantastic services for victims of domestic violence. So that's where it starts. It starts by simply holding up your hand and saying, reaching out to someone and saying, I need some help, because that help is out there, but we can't help folks that we don't know about. One of the important programs that the YWCA runs, anytime a victim of sexual assault goes and reports it to police, and they go in for a sexual assault examination, the YWCA assigns them a SARA, an advocate on their behalf, to help walk them through that process, because it can be scary, it can be intimidating, and that person is there to be their voice and to fight for them, to answer questions they have, and to just kind of usher them through that process. And Walk a Mile in Her Shoes, that's one of the places where the money raised for that event will go to that SARA program.